Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name, some of you may know this, is Frank Ruder. I'm chair of modern and contemporary philosophy here at the University of Dundee, and I'd like to welcome all of you and that are present here, and numerous people online that I keep admitting. This is why I'm so stupidly stare at the screen, who are joining us from the world, and it's quite a group. So this is an event in the Dundee Philosophy Speaker Series, which is organized with the support of the Royal Institute for Philosophy, and also this particular event in cooperation with the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities. It's a very special event today, or at least I'm Hegelian, so what can I do? 3 reasons. This is Etienne Balibar, that's reason 1. And we have the immense pleasure of welcoming him today. It is Etienne's first time in Scotland, and his first time.
Second.
Oh no, oh, you ruined it. Okay, my son.
If you give me 1 minute in parenthesis, I shall not repeat the horrible mistake I made in my first visit, which was to Glasgow 40 years ago. So I was introduced to Dingo Lab, and I started my lecture like this. I'm very happy to be back in England.
Okay, you ruined my reason. So I have 1 reason, but that's also a dialectical position in this 1 divides then into 2, as some have said. So this is Etienne Balibar, and it's an immense pleasure of welcoming here today, because my friend Etienne does, without any doubt, really need no introduction, since his thought has been present and prominent for anyone who seriously tries to think through any of the many pressing problems of the contemporary world, and for understanding their conceptual setup and history, and because he's one of the most influential French thinkers on the planet. I just want to briefly introduce him in a very, and I hope you forgive me, personal and idiosyncratic way. I first encountered his thought, surprisingly, not through his famous contribution to reading Capital with Althusser, Rancière, Estable, and Mastret, but by reading, again, 3 books of the many he has published thus far, namely The Philosophy of Marx. What a daring title. It sounds like one makes 2 enemies at the same time.
Imposed on me by the publisher.
His 1976, I believe, book on the dictatorship of the proletariat, and I'm tempted to say again, what a daring title. Just imagine trying to find a publisher or a book contract with that title today.
Other times.
And his Race, Nation, Class. The first book, the book on Marx, is still, I think, one of the most succinct systematic presentations of Marx ever written. The second, certainly the most elaborate account of one of the most crucial concepts of Marxism, which, as Etienne demonstrates, cannot be severed from the idea of class struggle without fundamentally changing the entire theoretical corpus of Marx. And the third, written with Immanuel Wallerstein, is without any doubt one of the most important contributions to the understanding of the intricate linkages between race and nation and class, teaching us not only that racism is a thing for some classes, but rather that one has to think the very existence of racism against the background of the existence and the diversity of class relation and national political context. These idiosyncratic references are obviously highly selective, since Etienne has written over 20 books, and recently his Écrit started coming out. The most recent, that is the 3rd volume, entitled Cosmopolitique des frontières à l'espèce humaine, was published just last year. Etienne is an immensely influential and creative thinker to whom we owe some of the most important conceptual creations of our time. For example, the concept of the trans individual that he developed throughout his amazingly diverse oeuvre, and especially through his path-breaking reading of Spinoza and the concept of equal liberty, to name just those two, which articulates the tension at the heart of modern democracy, one could say, notably between equality, social rights, and representation and liberty, the freedom to oppose and withdraw from the social bond and contract. Etienne elaborates his concepts by bringing them into contact with its other. Back in each outside, it's just a site close by. Etienne Balibar is normally, but this is just the symbolic side of things which I want to mention, the anniversary chair professor at the Center for Research in Modern European Philosophy at Kingston University, and was visiting professor at the Department of French and Romance Philology at Columbia University. I'm immensely grateful that he is here and agreed to come and think with us. Dear Etienne, merci. Thank you for accepting our invitation. You being here means a lot and it's truly an honor. The title of Etienne Balibar's lecture is Global Racism as Reversed Cosmopolitanism. The floor is yours. I'll step over here.
Do I need to wear this device?
No, absolutely not.
The sound works?
Yes.
The image works? Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Frank. Thank you, Heather. Thank you all for inviting me and for being here today. Can you hear me? And yes, it is a great pleasure and it's a great honor to be speaking for the first time in Dundee. In fact, this previous visit to Scotland was very limited. So I'm very grateful to be invited. I owe you no less than three apologies in advance. First, the old man loses his mind sometimes, so I forgot something. I forgot my hearing device. And the consequence, I'm a little deaf, and I need your help to serve as, because I can't speak, of course, but I cannot hear very well, as an intermediary between us for the conversation. Second, I come with a talk, which I'm afraid is a little long. I hope not too long, but a little long. So I hope there will remain room enough for the discussion. And third, I have to read from this computer. So I'm not looking at you. I'm even less looking at the others in the online system. I'm looking as a complete idiot to my screen, Okay. So that's all for the apologies. This lecture is part of a work in progress in which I reconsider some hypotheses on the ideological structures and the political functions of racism, hence, of course, also anti-racism in our contemporary world that I had started to analyze in the book, thank you for mentioning it, co-written with Emmanuel Wallerstein, Race, Nation, Class, Ambiguous Identities, originally published in 1988. I try to update them, these hypotheses, with the help of more recent readings, research, and a better acquaintance with the huge corpus of scholarship and criticism, scholarly research and criticism that has changed our understanding of the problem in the last decades. Needless to say, contrary to some optimistic expectations from the last century, the problem of structural racism is far from losing its relevance today. On the contrary, it is acquiring, sadly, we must say, a new centrality and a new virulence in the globalized world, but also it is taking new forms and exhibiting new patterns of antagonism. Or it confronts us with a renewed necessity of articulating what, in fact, remains stable, bearing the visible traces of the formations of ancient or classical racism, I'll come to that, with what had been called in the last century already the new racism, a formula from Martin Barker that was widely adopted later, or better said, I would insist, the new racisms in the plural, and perhaps the new racisms, since what is at stake is a process of while following a guiding thread deriving from something that kept insisting in my work over the years, and that I maintain, I will try and delineate a different and perhaps more synthetic hypothesis. In a paper that I had given in 1988, the same year as the publication of Race, Nation, Class with Emmanuel, I had proposed the idea of racism in general as another universalism. This was indeed a provocation directed against the common idea that, by definition, racist discourses and practices or attitudes incarnate a rejection of universalistic values through the essentialization of differences, of particularities belonging or supposed to belong to certain groups, be they formulated in pseudo-biological or in cultural terms. In that paper, I contended that this was absolutely not the case, since theoretical racism in modern societies, as already in the ancient ones, aims at defining the essential characters of the human species as such, in its intrinsic diversity or system of differences deriving from a single principle. It always addresses theoretical racism, forgive me for the pedantic Greek, the katolou, or the totality. I quoted, namely Aristotle and Kant as proof. Of course, I was not claiming that this is the only way of universally thinking the human. And I was certainly not endorsing the symmetric idea that universalism as such is racist. Rather, I was relying on two basic ideas which I keep finding useful. First, under the category of universalism and the universal, we should not place only systems of values or ideas, but a discourse in a more complete and materialistic sense, to using the epistemological model elaborated by Foucault and applied precisely to the study of racism by Stuart Hall and others, which means institutions and practices within which these values and ideas are embedded, acquiring power or becoming performative. Second, universalistic discourses are always divided or internally challenged, not only by so-called anti-universalistic other discourses, but above all by other universalisms, which propose a different content or advocate the universalization of other values. For example, secular values against religious values. Both are universalist. As a consequence, the object of our discussions is not an ideal or abstract universalism, tautologically deemed unique in its kind, but it is a historical and socially determined universality with its conflicts and alternatives, and also its limits. There's no doubt in my mind that the Eurocentric racial discourse is eminently and remains such a universality, which explains in part, but decisively, its performative power. But this discourse is evolving, it's changing, and perhaps it is no longer purely Eurocentric or Western or Northern. This will be one of the stakes of my lecture. However, I will not simply continue with the critical examination of universalism and universalities, but I will switch to the category of cosmopolitanism, which clearly overlaps with universalism or works as one of its historical and philosophical names in the history of Western thought and politics, but has I shall indicate three kinds of reasons that pushed me in that direction. Number one, there is the importance of adopting a global point of view. More precisely, the point of view of the efficiency of racism as a discourse that unifies and totalizes the world, not just in the current phase of economic globalization, but since the very origins of the capitalist world system, as my friend Wallerstein taught us to call it, and its political organization. This is in particular the point of view illustrated by Denise Ferreira da Silva in her well-known book, Toward a Global Idea of Race, published in 2007, from which I draw essential inspiration. Number two, there are lessons to be drawn from the great current in the history of ideas, which elucidated the anthropological and geographic foundations of the classical ideas of rationality and progress, which are, of course, summarized or incorporated in the cosmopolitan ideal. I'm thinking in particular of the works probably not very well known in this audience because it's French and not translated into French, but believe me, this is a seminal book. Michel Duchet, D-U-C-H-E-T, called Anthropologie et Histoire au siècle des Lumières, Anthropology and History in the Enlightenment period, 1971, and more recently, and of course this is better known by you, Marie-Louise Pratt in the United States, Imperial Eyes, Travel Writing and Transculturation, published in 1992, which dovetail, both of them, with the critique of the coloniality of Euro-American civilization, inspired and initiated by Aníbal Quijano, The Coloniality of Power, 2000, and others. And finally, there is the undeniable importance for any discussion of anti-racist strategies in the post-colonial era of the debates prompted by the work of Stuart Hall. I had the enormous privilege of meeting Stuart once in my life, and I'll never forget that. The work of Stuart Hall on new ethnicities in the late 1980s, then on these are his words, diasporization, from diaspora, of course, and transculturation of identities, both Black identities and white or European identities. And I want to refer here, I'll return to it, the extraordinary posthumous series of lectures, The Fateful Triangle, Race, Ethnicity, Nation, published in 2017, to which in his own collection of essays, Against Race from 2002, his friend and in some sense follower, although he's of course very original thinker himself, Paul Gilroy, added the controversial idea of a post-racial planetary cosmopolitanism. He explicitly uses this word, emerging from the flows of reversed migrations from the periphery to the center, an idea which, as you perhaps know, prompted fierce rebuttals from representatives of various currents, the Black Power tradition, and the decolonial theorists. Other references should be added, of course. I want to propose a kind of leap forward with respect to these essential contributions, introducing the idea that modern racism, an institutional discourse which begins to take shape as a consequence of the European invasion. I prefer that to discovery and even to conquest. The European invasion of the Americas in the 16th century, and becomes reorganized as a consequence of decolonization in the mid-20th century, can be conceived, this modern racism, as an inverted, or perhaps even better, a reversed cosmopolitanism. We are aware, I am sure, of the fact that such a formula can be heard in two different ways. This is completely intentional on my part. Either we hear that global racism forms the reverse side, therefore the repressed or latent condition of possibility of the cosmopolitan order that was ideally conceived by philosophers, famously Kant, but he's not the only one, and practically implemented in such institutions as the world market, the universal system of exchanges. Or we hear that a cosmopolitan global society can emerge only as a dialectical transformation of the negative cosmopolitanism that produces the division of humankind, or the human race, as it is possible to say in English since the 17th century. This is a privilege of English. In French, you cannot say la race humaine. You have to say le genre humain or l'espèce humaine. But in English, you can say the human race in the singular. Check in the Oxford dictionary, first used in the 17th century. So into the division of the human race into a hierarchic system of races in the plural and without capital, and their distribution among the continents of the world. Of course, there is a strong tension between these two meanings, and it is this tension that I find revealing and that I want to try and explore. It also hints at a dilemma that we will retrieve in the form of Hegelian. You'll see why. Second, the question of the idea of the color line. And third, very briefly, I'm afraid, the question of the post-colonial global order. So first, the European Weltbild picture of the world. My thesis in this first part will be that Europe in the classical and modern age, the age of the complete colonization of the world, so that's the huge span period from the 16th, the early 16th to the late 19th century, also constructed the world in its own image. Or better said, it constructed a world onto which it could project its own image, an image that was largely the result of the projection itself. The European colonization of the other continents is indeed, we are aware that, a long and very conflictual process with successive stages, unequal success, not proceeding with the same methods in every direction of the planetary space. I'm particularly thinking, of course, of the direction to the West, the Americas, and the direction to the Orient. A process in which the central or self-proclaimed central nation state, an absurdity, of course, as we all know, given that the Earth is and Kugel, can't we say, what's the English for that? Good, ball.
Almost there. Yeah.
So, excuse me, a process in which the self-proclaimed nation states asserted their sovereignty through competition and war among themselves, mainly for the appropriation of colonial empires and the peripheral peoples and civilizations subjected to progressive destruction and enslavement, displayed, never forget that, obstinate forms of resistance that shaped, of course, in return, the process itself. It is no less complicated as a cultural and intellectual process in which successive disciplines of the natural and human sciences are formed and transform their epistemic paradigms, complementing each other in order to map the cosmos as a material and human resource that can be used to accumulate wealth and increase the power of the states, both internally and externally, always in close relationship to the adventures of merchant, industrial, and financial capital, and in relation to the development of scientific institutions supported by the state and organizing the self-consciousness of the civil society. The British Royal Society, of course, is the arch example of that. It is also well known that the progressive elaboration of race as an anthropological category, classifying and hierarchizing the humans in groups and types, according to the crucial criterion of the reproduction and generational transmission of bodily, the sexual reproduction and generational transmission of bodily and mental characters is a typical aspect of this process taking place at the intersection of natural history, later biology, and political philosophy, later sociology and ethnography. In particular, it combined the practical exploration of the world with the speculative deduction of its principle of evolution. Although this was not a simple process because, as several historians and critics have shown, the category of race cannot be just an extension to the human types of and so on and so on. And it is fairly obvious that a rigid hierarchization of human groups, according to racial criteria, allowing it to define some of them as naturally inferior or infrahuman, Untermenschen, hence also others as naturally superior or Übermenschen, superior humans, is a perfect tool for the exploitation of the first by the second in more or less brutal forms. In other terms, the development of a racial capitalism, to quote Cedric Robinson and others, which crucially relies on colonization, as was already the case with the category of natural slaves in ancient Greece. But I want to add something more, which has to do with the intelligibility of the world in which the Europeans live and rule, or try to rule. More precisely, with the representation, which indeed is an ideological construct, of this world as a world, a totality articulated in places or regions where the place and the origin or lineage, if you like, of the dominant and the dominated is predetermined in a complete manner. What I mean is that the concept race became the principle and the cornerstone of a cosmic order, which made it possible for the colonists settling in every part of the world, and more generally, the Europeans seeing themselves as the parents of these colonists, to understand or make sense of who they were, which essence and consequently which destination characterized them by describing the place where they belonged in comparison with the totality of other places. And this is precisely what the concept race made possible, establishing its cognitive centrality and making it very difficult to dispense with it historically. At this point, I quickly add two remarks, each calling, of course, for longer discussion. First, to say that the discourse of race and races makes it possible for the dominant group in the colonial world system to know himself, and from there, in the typical master-slave dialectic, to impose on others this way of knowing themselves as subject races, an extraordinary formula which does not come from Hegel, but from Lord Curzon and other great British colonizers. So knowing themselves as subject races in the contradictory form that Du Bois and Fanon will later analyze as double consciousness. This is not to say that such knowledge is authentic. It is formative of their identity, the Europeans, but it is not authentic. And in fact, it covers a complete misunderstanding of their real history and the historical sources of their power. And a fortiori, it makes it forever impossible for them to learn from their others, the subject races, what their histories and cultures contain. They can't even speak in an audible manner, as Gayatri Spivak famously explained. Therefore, the whole epistemic process we are talking about is ideological in its core. It consists of scientific ideologies, to use the apt category invented by another of my philosophical masters, Georges Canguilhem. But this ideological misrecognition is supremely efficient and performative. Second, Denise Ferreira is perfectly right to insist that it is not enough, or even it is misleading, to define the process of racialization of the human as a simple phenomenon of exclusion of certain humans. In fact, the great majority of the species from the moral, intellectual, political universality, whose natural bearers are the white Europeans, as if this universality is defined in an autonomous manner in advance, and its relation to the racial others is a purely negative one. They are, namely, lacking what defines man in its full and self-referential, or as she insistently writes, transparent sense. Hence, the general form of the humanist or enlightened motto against racism, or similarly, in fact, against sexism, accept no exclusion from the universal and its typical institutions, citizenship, education, personhood, etc. But in fact, the racial type of the dominant themselves is just as positively constructed in the relationship of power as the racial type of the dominated. And the epistemic devices used to legitimize this relationship of power, she names, Denise Ferreira, biology or the science of life and history. They are themselves organized as intellectual developments of this conflictual reciprocity, which lies, in fact, at the core of the disciplines. But I want to push this argument even further. It is not only the category of exclusion that is insufficient, it is also more subtly the category of otherness and the criterion of the recognition or misrecognition of the other, so influential, and for good reasons, of course, in contemporary ethical philosophy. This is a crucial question because on the one hand, there is every indication that the invention and codification of the category of race was a means to make sense in a self-serving manner, of course, for the Europeans, of the differences of other humans, who were progressively encountered or discovered by the Europeans in the course of their conquest, which, as we know, of course, also immediately meant extermination, particularly in the case which laid the foundations for the whole representation of the system, the conquest of the New World opened for invasion by Columbus, Cortes, and their likes. And on the other hand, the traditional argument, again, excuse me, the sentence was a little long. There's every indication that the invention and codification of the category race was a means to make sense of the difference of other humans. And on the other hand, a traditional argument against the colonial conquest as exploration of the world, already illustrated in the discourses of Las Casas or Montaigne, was that the Europeans discovered nothing because they essentially ignored the otherness, the full otherness of the other. I do not deny that, but I would suggest that this ethnographic argument obscures the crucial fact that racialization or the construction of a racial picture of the human must concern not only the other, but did not racialize the Jews, the Slavs, and the Gypsies, and a few others, without picturing themselves as a superior race of so-called Aryan masters. We're thus back to the mirror effect and to the construction of a cosmos in which the dominant can be identified as a necessity, necessarily such. Let me conclude this quick outline of the intelligible function of the racial model with two other historical remarks. First, the typical disciplinary diagram or system, epistemic system that performs the task of racial identification, which originates, as Duché and Pratt and others perfectly explained, in the travel literature about unknown continents and regions, terrae incognitae, from the 16th century onwards, finding its achievement in the 18th century as exemplified paradigmatically in the work of Immanuel Kant, is the complementarity of geography and anthropology. And in contemporary classes of courses of philosophy, after some prestigious readers, Foucault is one of them, but he's not the only one, the Kant's Anthropology book published in the very last years of his life under his supervision by one of his disciples, putting together, cutting and pasting pieces from his lifelong teaching, has become a very central text. Every philosophy student knows now today, are supposed to know that you cannot read the Critique of Pure Reason if you don't read the Anthropology as its reverse side, so to speak. But Kant's geography is just as important as his anthropology, and it is an absolutely stunning book, also made of lectures like that. So the complementarity of geography and anthropology, both being inspired by models from natural history, which produce what I would call the cosmogonic effect. This is an essential coupling with one of the two disciplines mapping the space, dividing the globe into, I would say, natural historical regions, which more or less coincide with the continents and the continental division of empires, Europe forming a special continent despite every geological evidence, while the other discipline is mapping the species by dividing it into discrete, separated subgroups, at least ideally or normatively, so that a hybrid or mestizo human is a kind of monster. The harmonious teleological structure of the world qua world of man, or for man's use and destiny, consists, therefore, of a correspondence between the regions and the races, or their origin. The privilege of the dominant race, originally located in the central region and incarnating the top level of the human capacities, learning, policing, governing, etc., being to visit all other places and to displace the other races, as in the slave trade, in the continuation of its own traveling. However, there is a crucial complication, again emblematically revealed by Kant's anthropology. He divides the human species or humankind, in German, Gattung, in two parallel ways, into peoples, Völker in German, and into races, Rassen. There are several words for race in German, but in Kant's anthropology, it's Rassen. This complexity opens a kind of normative uncertainty in the very middle of the picture of the world, the Weltbild, only to reinforce the main scheme in the end. Why? Because peoples, properly speaking, as political groupings, in his description, only exist in the central region within the dominant white or civilized race. Kant's examples of peoples are purely European, the French, the German, the Scots, etc., with the sole apparent exception of the Palestinians, which in fact are the Jews. Whereas the rest, when you read that, that are necessary to form a people. There can exist, ontologically speaking, no barbarian peoples. So that in the last instance, it is the logic of race which territorializes the peoples themselves. And then there is a normative content of the racial model. The brutal short circuit of complex developments which play over 2 centuries from the emergence of the evolutionist model in geography and anthropology to its official refutation, sanctioned by the 2 UNESCO statements on the race question from 1950 and 1951. Why there are 2 statements with 1-year distance is it's a fascinating question that I leave aside. Very bizarre history for the moment. We can return to that discussion if you like. I would say that 3 complementary procedures were at work, emerging one after the other. The first was, of course, hierarchization, combining ideas of election with a theological background and of selection with a more technical, mystic or natural background. Since different races are always unequal in this description, from the point of view of their beauty, their intellectual capacity, their sense of morality and religion, their entrepreneurial, I would say, virtues, the capacities to become merchants. The second was naturalization, since human races can be conceived as species within the species. A very difficult point, however, I already alluded to that for the analogy with natural history because of the mutual fecundity, of course, of the human races. And the third was historicization in an evolutionist way, making progress the ontological mark of the human, since the degrees of perfection of the races mean, the unequal degrees of perfection of the races mean that they are more or less advanced or more or less rapidly advancing on the road of civilization, which also means, that's a very, very important aspect, that inferior races are to superior races like children or infants to adults. Reason why the superior races are the natural educators of the inferior races, what Claude Lévi-Strauss will later, very important category, I believe, the archaic illusion. This last remark also illustrates a fundamental element of cruelty intrinsic to the racial model, which brings back the question of exclusion that I had left with Denise Ferreira on the side, not as the principle of the classification, but as the limit it creates for the human, the limit where in fact the human annihilates itself in several modalities. The savage races at the bottom of the hierarchy, a position which remains empirically uncertain because it can be occupied depending on the stakes and the discursive strategies by Africans or some Africans, or by the Aboriginals, or by Fuegians and other surviving Americans, etc. Our races originally and forever, in fact, incapable of learning, of becoming educated by the superior races, therefore hardly discernible from animality, and rightfully exterminated when necessary, because they are themselves very cruel, ferocious. These limits are also the limits of the possibility for the superior race to govern, to educate, to assimilate the inferior races. Are they limits to the possibility of exploiting the inferior races, having their members work and serve on behalf of the Europeans? This is, of course, much less clear, or even it works in the opposite direction. Witness, of course, the case of slavery, for which the Black race seems to have been predestined as consequence of its alleged savagery and primitivity, and more generally, the correspondence that can be established between a hierarchy of technical requirements and a hierarchy of racial skills. This was a little long, but I come now to my second point or idea, global lines. At this point, we must bring in another scheme which relies on a discussion of the great idea of the color line as it was introduced famously by W.E.B. William Edward Bogart, Du Bois in Souls of Black Folk, 1903, with the famous opening sentence that we all know and that I quote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America, and the islands of the sea." I love the islands of the sea, probably the Caribbean. The color line, as indicated here, is not just a way of inserting or inscribing a racial overdetermination into a pre-existing picture of the global world processes, or adding the racial discriminations to other antagonisms, national, class, and so on, which form the conditions of contemporary politics. It is also, again, a way of constructing the world, although from a completely different point of view. In fact, it performs, I would say, a reversal of the hierarchic and naturalistic classification of races that characterize the Eurocentric Weltbild, all the more remarkable, however, because it proceeds from, I would say, a radicalization and a denunciation of the violent element lying at the core of this Weltbild, this world picture. Its ethical, political, and speculative effects are largely due to very point where the projects of reversing the existing racial cosmopolitanism and inventing a new cosmopolitanism that abolishes the racial discourse are competing and conflicting. The first dialectics that seems crucial to me is the dialectics of the global and the local. And even, as you will see, but I'll have to be very quick on that, beyond the local, the intimate. Therefore, a dialectics of objectivity and subjectivity. Thinking about it, Du Bois' line, he calls it a line. What is a line? If I had a blackboard, I would take a piece of chalk and I would draw a line, either vertical or horizontal, straight or curly. Topologically, a line is something very simple. It's just a partition of the space. So Du Bois' line has a very strange and complex design, which mathematicians would call a fractal pattern. I don't know if you know what a fractal is in geometry. It's a design that is repeated or replicated in every sub segment or at every point of the global line itself. It was used originally, among other uses, by geographers in order to create mathematical models for the coastlines on the seashore. So if you look at the broad map, there are capes and forces or gulfs, estuaries, etc. So it's something like this. And then you look at a small portion of the coast, it's again like this, and so on, indefinitely. So on the one hand, the color line is a global design, since it is the whole world that is sharply divided into antagonistic halves, I would say, by the color line. More in Du Bois' formulation, the darker races on one side and the lighter races on the other side. Although, of course, where do you switch from the darker to the lighter? I'll come to that. So there is no part of the world, even the islands of the sea, where the line is not drawn, is not to be observed. Therefore, there are no humans, individually or as groups, which are not always already pushed, rejected to one side or to the other. You arrive in a place that you have never visited, and you meet people, and they will be on one side or the other side of the color line. It is therefore the world as such, which, as a consequence of its modern history, including colonization, slavery, and their later consequences in different societies, becomes organized by the line in a conflictual manner. The modern world is therefore seen as this paradoxical unity whose content is not a coming together, but a dissociation of two estranged worlds. Of course, there are other ways of doing that. In a sense, this is what Marx did in the early pages, the first pages of the Communist Manifesto, calling what I call the world here, calling it history. History until now has been a history of class struggle, a civil war, which separated, blah, blah. So the modern world is seen as this paradoxical unity whose content is not a coming together, but a dissociation of two estranged, mutually estranged worlds. On the other hand, however, the line is essentially local because it is built into the institutions, the experiences affecting every place, and each time in a different manner, where racial discriminations and antagonisms take place, from a bus in a small city of Alabama to the unemployment rates in a whole country and so on. And it is because these myriads of local divisions converge into a single pattern, a great divide of the human, that a global line has historically emerged. The practices are local, if you like. But there is more. There is, as I said, a dimension of the line which is not only local but intimate. If we follow Du Bois' indication, that the very personality and identity of the Negro, as he calls him, is split or internally affected by the partition which locates him on one side. This is notoriously the object of the dialectic of double consciousness, later developed by Fanon and others. Whether the same pattern replicates or finds its replica on the side of the white is, of course, a difficult and crucial question, which I leave aside for the time. Humans, consciously or not, are crossed by the color line. A beautiful, although tragic expression that I love, of the same love, maybe I find striking, of the same idea in more geographic terms, was proclaimed by Latino or Chicano activists marching some years ago in the streets of US great cities, Chicago, Los Angeles, and so on, against their expulsion of undocumented migrants who were workers, of course, from the US territory with the motto, no cruzamos la frontera, nos cruzó la frontera. We did not cross the border. It's the border that crosses us, our identities, our lives. Second, Du Bois' color line has strange affinities, not only formal, with other representations of global lines whose institutional and political enforcement results in a binary configuration of the world with replicas at the local level. We might invoke, already quoted Marx, we might invoke such notions as the global North versus the global South divide, and there are others, such as the East-West antagonism and so on. But in my view, the most interesting and also the most paradoxical comparison is with Carl Schmitt's notion of geopolitical lines forming the basis of what he calls the title of his book, The Nomos of the Earth, in his genealogy of the Eurocentric juridical order, the one that, according to him, conferred their legitimacy on imperial wars and the colonial seizing of territories everywhere in the world. As you probably know, this is again a question much commented by philosophers and theorists in general. Schmitt uses nomos, or pretends to use nomos in its double Greek meaning as a partition and as a law. Why this affinity between Du Bois and revolutionary and Nazi, who is also a great counter-revolution? Again, because it involves a crucial reversal of a certain practical cosmopolitanism. As we know, Schmidt is a virulent critic of violence of the Kantian liberal cosmopolitanism, which wants to impose or claims to impose legal limitations on the use of violence by the states, for instance, through the action of international institutions. But he also believes that the colonial order is not shy of writing that. It's a way of civilizing this violence, and particularly warfare. This is argued in two steps. The correspondence is between the fact that the nation states in the core of the world system are negotiating among themselves, creating a normative framework for their conflictual relations, the wars themselves, and the fact that they are rushing in a competition for the conquest and the exploitation of the rest of the world, using any means at disposition for that. For him, the creative moments in the modern history of the planet coincide with the definition of lines or frontiers which separate two regions of the world, civilized and barbarian, such as the transatlantic, amazing formula, line of friendship or amity line, established by the Spanish originally, the Spanish and Portuguese kings at Tordesillas in 1494 under the aegis of the church, or the frontiers for the grabbing, the Landnahme of Africa by European powers decided in Berlin under the aegis of Bismarck in 1885. But the most interesting is the second step he takes. Schmidt's idea that global frontiers not only separate states, territories, empires, populations, but above all, dissociate forms of war and more generally, modalities of political violence. This clearly has a racial dimension, since it means that the colonial powers limit the cruelty of the war among themselves, or so it is proclaimed. Of course, the amazing thing is that Schmidt is a member of the Nazi establishment, leave aside all the controversial issues about his exact role. And therefore, he's a contemporary of what other theorists, Hannah Arendt in particular, would describe as an import of the colonial forms of violence, including the concentration camps already used by the British against the Boers, etc., and the genocidal, etc., from the periphery into the European center. So that this idea that the Europeans are waging civilized wars against one another is a very disturbing and problematic idea. But if you go one step further, I'm sorry, I should not elaborate too much because I need to conclude. But then it's very interesting to notice, and the current war in Ukraine is a catastrophic and horrible illustration of all that. The implementation of extreme or radical forms of cruel warfare against other Europeans could not, at least on the side of the Nazis, could not work without these other Europeans being transformed again into inferior races. And in fact, in the framework of the project, Hitler's project, to colonize the eastern part of the continent exactly in the same manner in which the French or the British had colonized Africa, and so on. Okay, return to it means that the colonial powers limit the cruelty of the war among themselves, or so it is proclaimed, while allowing it to transgress every rule of civility or civilization in the colonial realm. What I want to submit here is that the color line in Du Bois' sense is also a line that demarcates and distributes violence along racial lines for the whole world. Or that describes the political world or cosmopolis as a global economy of violence, where different forms are waged against people of different color. And we have the illustration of this every day in the United States and also some parts of Europe. The police doesn't suppress whites and repress the whites and black people in the same manner. So the color line is exhibited in its most violent modality. And the implication for the future of mankind is that it will essentially depend on the reduction of this dissymmetry as it is seen, not from above the states and nations which protect themselves from the absolute cruelty of violence waged against inferior humans, but from below, by the victims of this cruelty themselves. Not a geopolitical regulation, if you like, but a universal revolution, in fact. Then, in a third dialectical moment, we are led to asking a question about the community effect resulting from the double movement of a scission and a rebellion or an insurrection against this scission. It is especially interesting, I find, that Du Bois, in a poetic manner, which also has a political meaning, speaks of the black folk. He doesn't speak of a nation, as other African-American activists would do later, or had done before in the framework of the movement for a return to Africa. And also not of a people in a constitutional sense. We might say in Deleuzian fashion that this folk, characterized through an understanding and a description of his source, is a way of naming a missing people, both in a negative but also in a positive sense. It is less than a civic or political entity, but it is much more than a purely juridical or national construct. In fact, this folk is a multitude distributed among many living places, and it has a deep, effective, symbolic relationship to the places, the cotton fields, the urban ghettos, the households and the churches, etc., where the reciprocity of membership was created among its individuals. But it has no territory. And in a sense, it is bound to remain geographically dislocated. Even clearly, if we admit that the ultimate black folk is not just a group of African Americans, but the Atlantic community, the object of Gilroy's book, famous book, that includes at the same time all the black people on both sides of the ocean. And it is historically, so it is geographically dislocated, and it is historically fragile. I would say its community is both intense and fragile, because what it has in common, this is what Du Bois says, is the memory of a traumatic trace, that of slavery, the slave trade, the passage, the Atlantic passage, the cruelty of the work in the plantations, the enduring discriminations after the abolition, etc., continuously reenacted by contemporary discriminations and violences, which is also a trace, of course, of revolts, civil resistances, solidarities, artistic creation, and so on. The line doesn't act, we see here clearly, as a simple border line. It acts as a contradictory limit point of the two forms of negativity, destitution and revolt or self-assertion. Finally, there is another dialectics that we can attach to the, what time is it? Okay. Do you have a few more minutes?
Yes.
Thank you. It's provided we take into account another dialectics that we can attach to the scheme invented by Du Bois, provided we take into account more recent uses of his notion, which display a striking oscillation. It is in fact a dialectic of uncertainty in the very drawing of the demarcation. This is already latent in Du Bois' enumeration of the subjects affected by the line, which seems to anticipate later anti-racist and racist developments. The difficulty at stake is a difficulty in deciding where the line is drawn in the multiplicity of so-called colors, and the very meaning of the name color. Who is a white and who is a black? What makes whiteness or blackness, and whether, difficulty in deciding whether the line that separates the whites and whiteness itself, whether the line separates the whites and whiteness itself as a claim of racial superiority of or sovereignty over the populations of the world from every other color, or hybridization of colors, which seems to be the logic of many contemporary anti-colonialist movements and the post-colonial attitude itself. Or it is a line that separates the Black people, infamously called Negroes in the racist discourse, which, however, can be performatively reversed against its inventors. We proudly declare that we are Negroes, from all non-Black colors, or the multiplicity of brown, for which intention, in order to preserve the uniqueness of the experiences linked to slavery. Of course, very interestingly, again, parenthesis, if you allow me, this uncertainty is reflected in some highly, in institutions, and highly significant and beautiful literary texts. Ever since I read I finally succeeded in reading Island, where the mestizos or mulattoes, always, of course, despising names, are progressively emancipated from the stigma as they progressively lose the drops of Black blood in their ancestry. Whereas in the English colonies, it's just the reverse. One drop, so-called drop of Black blood, that is one Black ancestor among your grandparents, and you're a Negro. There's no escaping that. So, as we know, this is a complex problem because, in a sense, both modes of identification are strategically necessary against institutional racism, but they do not lead to the same politics or cosmopolitics, neither subjectively nor objectively, especially when they are confronted with other forms of racial discrimination and oppression, which themselves are local and global, such as Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, Arabophobia, xenophobia, and all the byproducts of nationalism and fascism in different parts of the world. I come to that. This problem acquires a decisive function if we now, still very briefly, try and assess, quick conclusion, the shift that has been produced by decolonization and post-colonial globalization in the racial construction of the world. So I will call this very last development post-colonial planetarism. In the previous developments, we have been confronting what I propose to consider constructions of the world, cosmologies and cosmogonies, the Eurocentric colonial Weltbild, and the critical idea of the color line as conceptualized by Du Bois and his readers, which at the same time make it possible to introduce a logic in the description of the world, its multiplicity, its diversity, the relationship of humankind to its environment, and to define subjective places, situations, or viewpoints from which the world is perceived as a conflictual totality, a combination of order or disorder and movement or resistance to movement. What is in order now is to discuss the decomposition of these constructions as it is produced by contemporary of globalization. Unfortunately, I have spent so much time, plus parentheses, on the two constructions that we inherit from the past, and especially the first, but how to do otherwise. I have very little time to devote to this new stage, and I will present it only in the form of open questions. My first question is, of course, a question of principle. The question whether we should speak of the emergence of a post-racial order, either as a goal for ongoing struggles and hopes. Paul Gilroy's book titled explicitly After Race, or as an objective tendency which is already changing the world, or on the contrary, we should stick to the idea that together with capitalism and other structures of domination, the racial order, rather disorder, is essentially invariant, although possibly expressing itself in new discourses without races, or better said, without officially and scientifically imposed races. This question is hotly debated because it has direct political consequences, but perhaps I say this very quickly, it is a false dilemma. The question that we must ask, and here I'm following as closely as I can the analysis of Stuart Hall, unsurpassed in my view, as they are synthesized in his posthumous book already quoted, The Fateful Triangle, Race, Ethnicity, Nation, arising from the Du Bois lectures delivered in 1994, is the question of the modality of the trace that the racial system of classification and discrimination leaves on our institutions and our subjectivities at the most intimate level. This question is a constitutive one because, in a deep ontological sense, race itself was never anything other than a trace. And I took part a long time ago at the University of California, Irvine, in a conference with Fred Moten and others on one side, and Jacques Derrida, still alive at the time, on the other side, and played on the word. So if I had a blackboard, write it, it was called trace. Small t, big R, and then again small A-C-E-S. A trace, that is race, and race, that is trace. The genealogical trace of an origin, an ascribed difference and hierarchy, a violent division of labor, naturalized and institutionalized, systematic and systemic violence waged by some humans over other humans, etc. But the situations in which and historical conjunctures in which this trace is either openly displayed, ostentatiously proclaimed, or repressed and disguised, therefore conscious or unconscious, that makes an enormous difference in its construction and effects, I would argue. We may propose at the same time that nothing is erased, even when much is forgotten, so that it becomes a vital necessity for anti-racism. And this is the agenda of so many of our contemporary anti-racist movement, Black Lives Matter, for example, to preserve the memory of the racial divide, to lift the erasure. And that the processes of racialization in the contemporary world, without which there is no reproduction, no continuous activation of the trace. This is not just a question of memory, even unconscious memory. It's a question of the continuity and the continuation and the reproduction of institutions and practices, which allows it to make sense of the shift from the biological or pseudo-biological evolutionist definition of race to so-called culturalist definitions of groups at war, meaning, in fact, culturalist is almost a euphemistic code name for ethnicity and religion. Otherwise, then, as just masks for the willing perpetuation of a discredited social order, a way of neutralizing the critiques that it elicited in the past centuries. Again, this is an open question whose determinations are not fully clear. This quite naturally leads to the great question of the articulation of a new racist order with the post-colonial organization of the global stage and the various societies which belong to it. As we know, post-colonial is an essentially ambivalent term, which indicates that colonization proper over. There are no longer any official colonies in today's world, except Palestine, not a minor exception. Although there are clearly unofficial ones remaining, like the French islands in the Caribbean or the Indian Ocean. And I mentioned this in the very day in which the French army or police and military forces are trying to wage a terribly cruel colonial operation in the Comores, in Mayotte. And at the same time, it indicates that the consequences of colonization are impossible to dissociate from the existing modes of production and government in our societies, which have changed. My conviction, which I developed elsewhere, is that the current form of capitalism in the world, both in the North and the South, the East of the West and the West, is post-colonial just as it is post-socialist, in the sense of a reaction or reorganization reacting to the end of colonialism. The question, therefore, is about the transformations of coloniality and imperiality. The ritual Weltbild and the color line did organize the colonial and imperialist order. What are the discriminations and inclusions that organize the post-colonial globalized order, forming the background on which what French Réunionnais from the island of Réunion, politologist and feminist Françoise Vergès has called its geopolitics rely, on which background it relies. My hypothesis subjected to questioning will be the following. Clearly, the discrimination based on color and other genetic characters keeps nourishing the violent patterns of indignity, to borrow the formula privileged by French-Nigerian scholar Norman Ajari, who now teaches in Edinburgh, which humiliate and segregate the descendants of Black slaves and African colonized people. But there are other forms which are explicitly based on ethnicity, particularly the condition of ethnic minorities in a nation state, and religion, particularly the antagonism between Islam and other religions, monotheistic or not. Think of India, but not exclusively of the other cases. This cannot be considered, in my opinion, or the opinion that I have reached, cannot be considered a cover-up of racial discriminations, although it frequently intersects with them. On the other hand, it is not only acceptable, but I believe necessary to identify these discriminations and exclusions, very often murderous and sometimes even genocidal, with forms of racism in a generalized sense, so that we may submit a hermeneutic or propose a hermeneutic turn of the following style. In the classical colonial age, people were racialized in order to become incorporated into a pre-existing pattern of races on either side of a racial global line, whereas in the contemporary post-colonial age, quasi-races are created as a consequence of the development of a multiplicity of institutional and cultural racisms. Is there, nevertheless, a structural element that we could invoke to account for the analogies and complementarities of all these racisms? I believe the main one is their dependency on nationalism, which is perhaps, sadly, with terrible consequences, the single ideological discourse that dominates politics and geopolitics today. It is also a consequence of decolonization, the imposition of the nation form by the dominant imperialist powers at the expense of internationalist projects, such as Pan-Africanism, where we meet again with the legacy of Du Bois, and the vindication of nationalism by anti-imperialist struggles themselves, as a way to challenge the sovereign power of the empire, which had an extraordinarily perverse consequence on the development of post-colonial nations, as Fanon, among others, had anticipated. Not to forget, of course, the nationalist ressentiment of former colonial empires like France or Britain. Gilroy's first book, or one of his first books, you may remember that. So the title of different kind of movie had the title "The Empire Strikes Back." No part in the world today, whether in the north or the south, where nationalism is not virulent and on the rise, with most of the time developments of xenophobic discourses and aggressive practices aiming at migrants and ethnic or religious minorities, up to the genocidal practices, which are very difficult to counteract. Europe is clearly no exception. China is no exception. Think of Tibet or Xinjiang. India is no exception. Think of the condition of Muslims or Dalits. The Maghreb, former French colonies of Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, is no exception. Even South Africa is no exception, which perhaps is one of the most tragic illustrations, not to mention the rest of Africa with its genocidal episodes. In my old contributions to the book written with Wallerstein, Race, Nation, Class, I proposed to analyze racism as an internal supplement. This is the somewhat Derridian terminology that I used, of nationalism and added to nationalism. A supplement that is both necessary and conflictual, or if you prefer, that reinforces and disaggregates the nation form. For nationalism, it's necessary for nationalism to become hegemonic. This thesis has been contested, I'm perfectly aware, sometimes quite forcefully and rejected, for instance, by Denise Ferreira that I was quoting, perhaps rightfully so, because it seemed to lack generality and miss other crucial determinations, particularly those relying on imperialism. I would propose, nevertheless, that it is gaining validity because the age of globalization and the permanent crisis of globalization in which we live is also the age of nationalisms, both defensive and offensive, despite the apparent contradiction of both concepts, globalization and nationalism. We are told that repeatedly, again and again, that this cannot go together. It goes together. Nationalism is the reversed cosmopolitanism par excellence, but the confrontation with the racisms globally inscribed in nationalism as their internal supplement is also perhaps a decisive pathway towards the negation of the negation, reversing the reversal to produce a new, still unheard of model of cosmopolitanism, which is our uncertain future. I wanted to include in this pattern other determinations of the current globalization where its articulation with the new racisms also centrally feature, particularly the biopolitical effects of globalization. For instance, the medical apartheid on a global scale that was stigmatized, denounced by Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, the Director General of the World Health Organization during the pandemic, which is not finished, and the genocidal dimension acquired by the suppression of refugees and migrants, which are grotesquely seen as agents of a kind of reversed colonization called the Great Replacement, a category coined by a French fascist ideologist and later adopted in the US, in New Zealand, in Sweden, in Tunisia, etc. This is very much part of what I call the displacement from a racial worldview to a global process of multi-dimensional racialization or expansion of trans. A message from
Okay, I explained the procedure in the meantime. So everyone online can put their questions in the chats and I will read them out and we can gather questions here. We take a quick break as we can see and you can gather your thoughts and then raise your hands.
exactly as emergency, but it's a problem I can't.
Yeah.
I hope not. Some memory problems is not lost somewhere in this unknown country.
You want to step outside for a moment?
Sorry?
You want to step outside for a moment?
Sorry for that.
Okay. Are there any immediate questions? We have one online already. I thought I'd start off, but if there are no immediate questions, I'm just gonna. Okay, there are several questions here, so don't worry. You have time to think. I'm gonna read it out. I hope that's all right. Thank you very much for the interesting and inspiring lecture. Would you say that in the future there can be a new political struggle that reforms the realm of the political, the politique, in such a way that a new antagonistic line can replace the color line. I'm thinking of the emergence of a new political line of conflict in the sense of a secular reading of St. Paul's words to the Galatians: there can be neither Jew nor Greek, for you are all one in Christ. The emergence of a new constitutive difference of the political Christians versus non-Christians, which replaces the old one, Jews versus Hellenes. Marx's class struggle would have the potential to be such a new antagonism. However, also the Marxist countries were not preserved from the influence of the color line.
Giorgio Agamben?
Maybe under a code name.
That's a very, very, very interesting question. I mean, the reason why I struggled, no, I did not struggle, but I I concerned myself at such length and with perhaps some unnecessary subtleties with the meaning of the idea of the color line, the color line precisely has to do with an attempt on my side, and I'm sure many others are working along similar lines, to understand why the color line is not erased and will not be erased to become something like a simple metaphor, if you like, that it is intrinsically imaginary and symbolic in its content. There's no doubt about that, but that doesn't make it a simple metaphor, because, as I said, it's the flesh of the thing is made of institutions, practices which are completely real. So after this question, I might ask, I don't believe in the erasure or a suppression of the color line any more than I believe in the suppression and withering away of the class antagonism. So, for the sake of this discussion today, I know it can develop in many different ways. I will readily admit, and believe me, this is not just a way of proposing something like an intellectual biography, that as a good Marxist, Althuserian or not, I certainly had begun with the idea that the class antagonism, in some sense, in the capitalist, in the contemporary, in the modern capitalist system, is more decisively and profoundly rooted in the structures of the society than the color line or the racial division. And of course, later I became aware of the fact that this could be reversed. If you read Eric Williams or Cedric Robinson or their followers, you are proposed the idea that in fact it is the color line, or it is the color, the racial discrimination that really grounds capitalism in history, and the class antagonism is almost a kind of a consequence, or superstructure of that. So at some point, and my collaboration with Wallerstein, but also other circumstances, played a huge role in that. I became convinced that the idea of granting a kind of ontological privilege to one of these antagonisms over the other is pure nonsense. And it is precisely what a global perspective should allow you historically and in the present to overcome. Now, of course, one of the ideas that is latent, and you might see, but you are too shy. I mean, you are too obscure. There are much better presentations of this issue by other people. I'm ready to admit that. Is that what the post-colonial age in which we live, called globalization officially, produces is not a blurring, but it's an intersection, the permanent intersection of the two kinds of antagonism, so that they're not distributed into different spaces and political spaces. Probably that was never the case, and that was never or never completely the case. It's striking to read the pages in which Marx and Engels and the racialization of the Irish, of the Irish. So the immigrants are already there, the racialized immigrants, in the very heart of the industrial capitalist metropolises. But I would be tempted to suggest that there's no place in the world today with, of course, inequalities, different patterns that need to be described, where you don't have at the same time a racialized class struggle and a racial antagonism heavily structured in class. So that leads to the idea that neither of the structures of the antagonisms disappears, but that also that neither of them remains to descriptable, I would say, in the forms that we knew. There's too much passéism, I would say, in many description of both, from my point of view.
I'm coming in quickly. We have more questions online with a quick question about what you call the reverse, because on one hand side, what you call the creation of quasi-races, that seems to be a desubstantialized racism, right? I mean, it's almost a racism of performance, or right? I mean, there's a racism of success.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's beautiful.
A racism of success, obviously. I mean, if you're not successful, you belong to a different race, almost. But there's the reverse side is that even, let's say, nationalist discourses now speak an internationalist language sometimes. Right? I mean, I remember Le Pen met with the German AfD and with the Dutch right. They're all nationalists, but they think they internationally should cooperate.
The legacy of fascism.
Yeah,
it existed exactly in the same manner, and with well, we'll see where that leads. I'm not very optimistic.
yeah.
But in the same form in Europe in the 30s. I mean, and of course, interestingly, it was largely because the Communist Revolution in 1917 had launched with all the contradictions that we know only too well, of course, an internationalist model of politics, that the fascists themselves, that is Horthy, Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, I must forget a few other of these guys, created their own internationalist form of politics. Of course, not with the aim, not with the aim of overcoming the nation form as such, I cut you, I did cut you instead of letting you go to the end of your argument. Sorry, I'm terrible. Let me finish with that. But paradoxically, and that's probably the paradox that you have in mind, with the aim of creating kind of international basis for the perpetuation of the nation as an absolute form of politics. But I was using, I use Schmidt all the time, and I've been sometimes stigmatized for doing that. I'm not the only one on the left. But Schmidt is extraordinary from this point of view. And here I will refer to a text which is, I urge you all to read it. The German language that was written in 1923, which is called Democracy and Parliamentarism or something like that. So that's very interesting because it's the very day after Mussolini's march on Rome. And of course, it's so little time, shortly after the Soviet Revolution, the Civil War in the East and so on. It's clear that Schmidt is not only obsessed, but he's fascinated by the Bolshevik discourse, of the revolutionary brand of socialism that the Bolsheviks incarnate. And therefore, when in our conversation a moment ago, when we had a coffee together, Frank quoted Sorel, who is an essential source of Schmidt's reasoning at this moment. So he uses Sorelian terminology, and he says the politics of our times is governed by two great myths. Doesn't say ideology, he says myth, political myth. The socialist myth, today incarnated by the Bolsheviks and the communists, and the national myth, which in practice means fascism, incarnated by Mussolini. And what is taking place in Italy before our very eyes is experimental. It's 1923. It's experimental demonstration of the fact that the nationalist myth, that is the fascist brand of politics, is stronger than the socialist one, contrary to appearances. And I'm haunted by that because I look around us in these days and I observe this international network of nationalisms in Europe and elsewhere, And I ask myself, are we going to verify once again that the nationalist myth is stronger than the socialist one? And so, of course, one of the keys lies in the several aspects of the problem. I've said nothing about ecological problems, blah, blah. But lies in the question whether anti-racism or the reversal of the racist world picture of the acquires a capacity to mobilize masses, citizens, the citizens. Experiences of violent oppression that African Americans lived and in the US, and it's not exactly. That's one of the problems. It's not exactly reaching towards other, but its influence on other progressive movements in the society has been huge. So I have no impression.
Thank you very much. I have a bit of a philosophical request to perhaps maybe elaborate a little bit on the status of dialectics in your presentation, because I think perhaps one can identify some of the very elegant moves that you read through Kant, for example, is perhaps an atrophying of dialectics, an atrophy.
Atrophy. Yes.
Destruction of,
yes.
of dialectics.
Yes.
Perhaps, often one speaks of, the dialect between global and local, multiple and one. And through perhaps what one can identify in what you presented in the Kantian move is a reinscription of this difference between the global and the local into the local itself, into the global itself.
Yes.
And is perhaps manifest in your elucidation of Du Bois' line, how the global line is somehow experienced on the local level as well.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering if perhaps this destruction of which somehow complicates the status of whether or not a global and local exists in a dialectic at all. I'm just wondering if you can.
Well, that's a fascinating, huge, beautiful question. And thank you for that. Immediately, I want to say two things, but you're welcome to push me beyond that. First, my interest in Kant is growing. You laugh. You're a philosophy teacher, retired from the French academia 20 years ago. Declares fascination for Kant, that I am teaching, discovering new elements, or becoming aware that in a certain tradition that Frank and I participate of, Kant is forever refuted by Hegel. And Hegel is not always refuted by Marx, because on the contrary, there are elements in Marxist thinking that we can really make sense of only if we continuously return to Hegel. But Kant seems to be overcome. And not interestingly, many of the postmodern philosophers who were the masters of my generation, Foucault, Deleuze, they're very French in regards to Adorno is a complicated case. They're more Kantian than Hegelian in a sense. But the reason why I'm so interested is a somewhat different one. It's because the tautology, of course, it's in my title, but, because the issue of cosmopolitics, and behind cosmopolitics, of course, there's also cosmopolitanism as an ideal, if you like, or as an idea, is I believe one of the Kantian point of view allows you to tackle, and the Hegelian does not. For Hegel, the question is forever settled. Cosmopolitanism, the idea of is a beautiful utopia. It's a myth in the ordinary sense of the term. So to discuss this question, it means that you are immediately floating in the clouds. The clouds are very material today, but that's the only real thing is the state, which in fact is a nation state. So the fascinating thing, of course, is that contrary to certain vulgar Hegelian presentations of Hegel, Hegel doesn't give the state as the end of history, as if every contradiction is settled. You need to reach the end of the philosophy of right, and there you discover, of course, that there is something beyond the state form, which still needs to be addressed, which is war, international war. So that's not the nice theorist of reconciliation. But to address the issue of war, you don't need a concept of cosmopolitics. So the question of cosmopolitics is back in our days in a multiplicity of forms which are related to one another. We're becoming aware of the fact that politics is a serious concept only if it includes a global dimension, which can come from many things. I mean, environmental crisis, but also post-colonial migrations, post-colonial struggle. And on the other hand, we've been confronted, that was the history of political theory in the late last 20 years of the 20th century, etc. The flurry, I would say, of post-Kantian or neo-Kantian's elaborations of the cosmopolitan idea as an institutional instrument for the preservation of democracy, I would say. Habermas being the perfect example, and others with him. So my temptation, I would say, to return to Kant once again, to put it quickly, has to do not with the fact that I would dislike Habermasian theorizations. I very often agreed with many of the things he was defending, especially concerning Europe and the political construction and things like that. Anti-nationalist stance. But with the fact that I believe to be able to discern in Kant the formulation of cosmopolitical problems, which are ignored both by Hegelian forces of the of history or the canning of reason or whatever you like, and by I would say liberal Kantians. So perhaps here I'm influenced also by my friend and master Derrida on the question of hospitality. So I return, that's in the last part of the thick book I published last year, to the Kantian, it's not a treatise, but it's an essay, Versuch, zum ewigen Frieden, on perpetual peace. And I was once again fascinated by the fact, I just put this quickly, by the fact that the Kantian principle he even says there's one rule that needs to be kept and observed to establish a cosmopolitan. As enemies. Now go back to the current situation in Europe and other places in the world, not only on the English Channel, La Manche, or in the Mediterranean, or in the Greek islands, but also in Bengal and on the Mexican border, U.S.-Mexican border. And what you observe, what you witness, is a systematic institution of this confusion, so that certain categories of people in today's world are not just foreigners in the ordinary sense, but they are always already, in fact, enemies and treated as enemies. So now you might say, to reassert the Kantian principle, for example, as Derrida and others would say, hospitality is the name for justice, one of the names for justice in today's world, might sound as another, in Hegelian terms, I would say, expression of the beautiful soul, the naive and hopeless proposal to substitute a good world for the bad one. In practice, it has a political and practical relevance. Now, there was something else I wanted to say, but I forgot. Too long.
We have one last question. And sorry if I didn't read out your questions. There were several in the chat, but one last from Aishi. She says, Aisha Chubukchu, probably I miss.
Oh, Aisha Chubukchu, yes. Hi.
Dear Etienne.
She teaches at the LSE.
Yeah. Dear Etienne, thank you very much for a fascinating lecture. Would you please elaborate a bit more your views on the future of anti-racism, the shape it should take in your view?
I will not answer that question. I'm not prescriptive. And even worse, first of all, I'm not prescriptive. Second, I'm not situated or located myself at the right place to really resolve what we, and I'm sure Aisha has exactly thinks the same, and many of us thinks the same, is the dilemma, or the yes, I know what I wanted to say, so I'll bring it back, of current anti-racism, which is not, I believe, a choice between humanist utopias on one side and very material and organized struggles on the other side. It's also not, as I understand it, a choice between this is not polite, but between universalisms on one side and if you like particularism on the other side. I hate the idea. Gilroy is not always, is clearly on one side, is not always immune, and he's been ferociously attacked for that, of the idea that a certain form of anti-racist struggle in the Black community, because it strategically, as you know, the famous formula, essentializes the Blackness, could appear as a kind of perverse, reversed form of racism. Of course, you would never say anti-white racism. That's a pure fascist terminology. But there certainly is a problem there. But yes, I mean, cosmopolitanism as a motto or as a principle to organize struggles is only on one side of contemporary anti-racists. I seem to choose theoretically or ethically, but in fact, I don't, because I know this is the dilemma. So I shall leave you with, with the other thing I wanted to say about Kant was the fact that about dialectics is that I'm making a kind of ironic, perhaps snobbish use of the. I've been playing with the negation of the negation in today's, but the dialectical category that I do not reduce to a scheme of negation of the negation in whichever sense is unity of opposites. So to use Kant in a fruitful manner, let's introduce in its text, I would say, a greater degree or intensity of the unity of opposites. And not by chance, this is the part of Kant's philosophy that he calls himself dialectics, where he discusses unities of opposites. Except he discusses, there is a cosmological unity of opposites, but he discusses it apparently purely in the speculative or theoretical realm. But there are practical similar.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much all for being here and coming. Thank you for that talk.
I'm sorry if I look at my.
Thank you for attending online. One final applause.